The date was June 23, 1941. German Panzer Commander Heinrich Eberbach was leading his tank column through the Lithuanian countryside when something appeared on the horizon that would haunt German armored forces for the next 4 years. A tank unlike anything they had ever encountered. A machine so revolutionary, so perfectly engineered for the brutal reality of mechanized warfare, that it would force an entire military doctrine to be rewritten. When the first T-34 rolled into combat, German anti-tank rounds bounced off its sloped armor like pebbles off a cathedral wall. The Wehrmacht's most experienced tank commanders, veterans of Poland, France, and the Low Countries, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to emerge from the future itself. This is the story of how a single tank design changed the course of World War II. How Soviet engineers, working in secret facilities across the USSR, created a weapon so devastating that it would earn the grudging respect of their enemies and strike fear into the heart of the Third Reich. But the T-34's journey to dominance was far from inevitable. It began with betrayal, near disaster, and a design philosophy that would challenge everything the world thought it knew about armored warfare. To understand the T-34's revolutionary impact, we must first journey back to the late 1930s, when the Soviet Union found itself caught between two nightmarish scenarios. In the West, Nazi Germany was rearming at a terrifying pace. In the East, Imperial Japan had already begun its brutal invasion of China, and border skirmishes with Soviet forces were escalating into full-scale battles. Stalin's Red Army was massive but outdated. The T-26 and BT-5 tanks that formed the backbone of Soviet armor were decent machines for 1932. But warfare was evolving at breakneck speed. The Spanish Civil War had shown that tanks needed better armor, better guns, and better mobility. The German invasion of Poland demonstrated that armored warfare had entered a new era entirely. Soviet tank designers faced an impossible challenge: create a tank that could outfight German panzers, survive Japanese anti-tank guns, cross Russian mud and snow, be manufactured in the thousands, and be simple enough for hastily trained crews to operate. Most military experts would have called this task impossible. Enter Mikhail Koshkin, a Ukrainian engineer who had risen through the Soviet system despite, or perhaps because of, his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. Koshkin had studied the failures of Soviet tanks in the Spanish Civil War, analyzed captured German vehicles, and reached a startling conclusion: everyone was building tanks wrong. In 1937, Koshkin began work on what would initially be called the A-20. But this project carried a deadly secret. Stalin's purges were decimating the Red Army's officer corps and engineering departments. Tank designers lived in constant fear that their innovations might be seen as sabotage, their failures as treason. Several of Koshkin's colleagues had already disappeared into the gulags. Others had been executed. Yet Koshkin pressed forward with a design philosophy that was radical for its time. Instead of trying to maximize one characteristic, speed, armor, or firepower, the T-34 would balance all three. But the real innovation lay in its sloped armor design. While German and Western tanks relied on thick vertical armor plates, Koshkin understood that angling armor could double or triple its effective thickness without adding weight. The mathematics were elegant and deadly. A 45 mm armor plate angled at 60 degrees becomes equivalent to 90 mm of vertical armor. Enemy shells would glance off rather than penetrate. It was a concept so simple that military historians still debate why it took so long to implement. But the T-34's most revolutionary feature wasn't its armor, it was its production philosophy. Koshkin designed the tank to be manufactured by semi-skilled workers using basic tools. Complex curves were eliminated. Welded joints replaced expensive casting where possible. Every component was designed for mass production in factories that might be under aerial bombardment. By 1940, the first T-34s were rolling off production lines in Kharkov and Leningrad. Soviet crews trained in secret, learning to operate a machine that represented a quantum leap in technology. The T-34's 76.2 mm gun could penetrate any German tank at combat ranges. Its wide tracks distributed weight more effectively than any contemporary design, allowing it to cross terrain that would bog down German panzers. Yet behind the scenes, disaster was brewing. Stalin's military purges had eliminated many of the Red Army's most experienced tank officers. New crews were poorly trained. Soviet tactical doctrine hadn't adapted to the T-34's capabilities. Worse still, Soviet intelligence was feeding Stalin exactly what he wanted to hear: that the Germans wouldn't dare attack the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht, meanwhile, was preparing Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by 3,300 tanks, would smash across the Soviet border in a surprise attack designed to destroy the Red Army within weeks. German intelligence had photographed T-34s during border incidents, but their reports were dismissed by high command. How could the subhuman Slavs have developed tank technology superior to German engineering? This racist blindness would prove catastrophic. As spring turned to summer in 1941, T-34s moved into forward positions along the Soviet border. Many were still being delivered to units that had never seen them before. Crews received minimal training. Communication equipment was often missing or incompatible. The Red Army's most powerful weapon was about to enter combat under the worst possible circumstances. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the largest military operation in human history began. Along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, German artillery erupted in a coordinated bombardment that could be heard from hundreds of miles away. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground. Panzer spearheads punched deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies. The initial German advance was devastating. Soviet units, caught completely by surprise, collapsed in chaos. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured in the opening weeks. Hitler's generals began planning victory parades in Moscow. But then something unexpected happened. On June 23, German Panzer Group 4 encountered the Soviet 2nd Tank Division near Ruzhnyi in Lithuania. The engagement began like countless others, German tanks advancing confidently, expecting to sweep aside outdated Soviet armor. Then the T-34s opened fire. German tank commander Hans von Luck later wrote, "Our shells simply bounced off the sloped armor. We had never seen anything like it. The T-34s seemed immune to our weapons while their guns could penetrate our Panzer IIIs and IVs at ranges we thought impossible." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. German crews who had dominated European battlefields suddenly found themselves outgunned and out-armored. Panic spread through panzer units as word spread of the ghost tanks that appeared invulnerable to German weapons. But here's where our story takes an unexpected turn. Despite their technological superiority, the T-34s were being destroyed at an alarming rate. Not by German guns, but by their own tactical limitations and the chaos of the Soviet collapse. The question that would determine the fate of nations was whether Soviet forces could learn to use their revolutionary weapon before the Wehrmacht adapted to counter it. The answer would come in the most unlikely place, a small city called Leningrad, where T-34s would face their ultimate test not in open battle, but in the frozen hell of urban warfare. As German forces approached Leningrad in September 1941, the city's defenders faced annihilation. The Wehrmacht had encircled the former Russian capital, trapping over 2 million civilians and soldiers in what would become the most brutal siege in modern history. But Leningrad's defenders had one crucial advantage: T-34s and crews who were finally learning how to use them properly. Lieutenant Colonel Zinovy Kolobanov commanded a small force of T-34s tasked with holding critical approaches to the city. On August 19, 1941, his tank encountered a German column near Voiskovitsy. What happened next became legend. Kolobanov's single T-34 engaged 22 German tanks and armored vehicles. Using the tank's mobility and the protection of its sloped armor, his crew systematically destroyed the entire column. German Panzer IVs and anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate the T-34's armor, while Kolobanov's gunner picked off enemy vehicles one by one. But this battle revealed something more important than individual heroics. Soviet crews were finally learning T-34 tactics. They discovered that the tank's wide tracks allowed it to fight effectively in snow and mud that bogged down German armor. Its reliable engine meant it could operate in sub-zero temperatures that froze German vehicles solid. The siege of Leningrad became a laboratory for T-34 tactics. In brutal urban fighting, Soviet crews learned to use their tanks' advantages: its ability to crash through buildings, its immunity to most German anti-tank weapons, and its capacity to operate in conditions that stopped other vehicles. Meanwhile, German forces were frantically adapting. The Wehrmacht rushed long-barreled 50mm anti-tank guns to the Eastern Front. Tank crews received new tungsten core ammunition. Most importantly, German engineers began studying captured T-34s, reverse engineering their sloped armor concepts. But these adaptations would take time the Wehrmacht was rapidly running out of. While T-34s battled German forces in the field, an even more crucial struggle was taking place behind Soviet lines. As German armies advanced deep into Soviet territory, Stalin ordered the largest industrial evacuation in history. Entire tank factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains and transported thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of German bombers. The Kharkov T-34 factory, the heart of Soviet tank production, was evacuated to the Urals in an operation that seemed impossible. Workers dismantled production lines piece by piece, shipped them across the Soviet Union, and rebuilt them in record time. Many factories were producing T-34s again within months of their evacuation. This industrial evacuation represented a strategic masterstroke that German intelligence had never anticipated. While Wehrmacht forces captured Soviet territory, the capacity to build T-34s was moving beyond their reach. By late 1941, Soviet factories in Siberia and the Urals were producing more T-34s than the Germans were destroying. The mathematical equation of the Eastern Front was shifting. Every month, more T-34s rolled off Soviet production lines. German panzer strength, by contrast, was slowly declining as losses mounted and replacement vehicles arrived in smaller numbers. But the T-34's greatest test was still ahead. By summer 1942, the T-34 had evolved from an experimental weapon into the backbone of the Red Army. Soviet factories had produced over 12,000 T-34s, while German tank production struggled to replace losses from the previous year's fighting. The Battle of Stalingrad would prove to be the T-34's defining moment. As German forces pushed into the city in August 1942, they encountered T-34s in numbers they had never seen before. Soviet tactics had evolved too. Tank crews now fought in coordinated formations, using combined arms tactics that maximized their vehicles' advantages. At the Stalingrad tractor factory, ironically, one of the plants that had been converted to produce T-34s, Soviet defenders used their tanks as mobile pillboxes. T-34s would appear from factory buildings, engage German forces, then disappear back into the urban maze. Their sloped armor proved nearly invulnerable to German infantry anti-tank weapons in close-quarters fighting. But the real revolution was happening in Soviet factories. Production methods pioneered for the T-34 were now producing the tank in unprecedented numbers. By late 1942, Soviet industry was building T-34s faster than the Red Army could train crews to operate them. The Wehrmacht's tank commanders began reporting encounters with T-34 units that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with overwhelming force, then vanish before German forces could respond. The psychological advantage had completely shifted. German General Heinz Guderian, the architect of blitzkrieg tactics, wrote, "The appearance of the T-34 tank was a nasty surprise. Our tanks were inferior in armor, weaponry, and cross-country mobility." The winter of 1942-43 marked the T-34's complete dominance of the Eastern Front. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive that encircled German forces at Stalingrad, was spearheaded by massive T-34 formations. These tanks, designed for mass production and harsh conditions, proved perfectly suited to the brutal reality of winter warfare on the steppes. The German response was predictable but too late. They rushed the Tiger I tank into production, a magnificent but complex vehicle that required months to build and could only be produced in small numbers. While German factories struggled to build dozens of Tigers, Soviet plants produced hundreds of T-34s monthly. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 became the T-34's ultimate vindication. German forces assembled their largest tank formation of the war, including new Panther and Tiger tanks specifically designed to counter the T-34. Yet Soviet forces, led by massive T-34 formations, turned Kursk into the graveyard of German armored power. At Prokhorovka, over 400 T-34s engaged German panzer forces in the largest tank battle in history. The slaughter was mutual and horrific, but the strategic mathematics were unforgiving. The Soviets could replace their losses within weeks. The Germans never recovered theirs. By late 1943, T-34s were advancing westward in numbers that staggered German intelligence. Over 40,000 T-34s would be produced during the war, more tanks than Germany built in total. The Wehrmacht found itself fighting an enemy with seemingly unlimited armored reserves. The T-34's impact extended far beyond individual battles. Its revolutionary design philosophy influenced tank development for decades. The sloped armor concept became standard on every subsequent tank design. Its emphasis on mass production over individual perfection changed military procurement forever. More importantly, the T-34 proved that technological innovation could emerge from unexpected sources. Western military experts had dismissed Soviet engineering capability. German racial ideology had blinded Nazi leadership to the possibility of Slavic technical superiority. The T-34's success shattered these assumptions permanently. The tank's design philosophy, optimized for production, reliability, and battlefield effectiveness rather than engineering perfection, became the foundation of Cold War military thinking. American, British, and French tank designers studied the T-34 intensively, incorporating its lessons into their own vehicles. But perhaps the T-34's most significant impact was strategic. By 1944, German forces were retreating on all fronts, pursued by Red armies equipped with seemingly unlimited numbers of Soviet tanks. The Wehrmacht's qualitative advantage had been overwhelmed by Soviet quantitative superiority, a superiority made possible by the T-34's revolutionary approach to armored warfare. The tank that had emerged from Stalin's purges and Soviet engineering secrecy had become the instrument of Nazi Germany's destruction. As Soviet T-34s rolled into Berlin in April 1945, they carried with them a bitter irony. The tank's designer, Mikhail Koshkin, never lived to see his creations triumph. He died in September 1940, just months after completing the T-34's initial design, a victim of pneumonia contracted during brutal testing conditions. Koshkin's fate reflected the human cost of Soviet innovation. The T-34 was created in a system that consumed its own creators, where engineering brilliance coexisted with political terror. Yet from this paradox emerged a weapon that changed the course of human history. The T-34's legacy extends beyond World War II. Its descendants, the T-54, T-55, and T-62, would dominate Cold War battlefields from Korea to the Middle East. Over 100,000 tanks based on T-34 principles were eventually produced, making it the most successful tank design in history. But the T-34's greatest lesson may be about the nature of military revolution itself. True innovation doesn't come from perfecting existing concepts. It comes from fundamentally rethinking the problem. When Mikhail Koshkin decided to balance firepower, armor, and mobility rather than maximize one characteristic, he created more than a tank. He created a new philosophy of mechanized warfare. Today, as military technology rapidly evolves through artificial intelligence, robotics, and cyber warfare, the T-34 story remains remarkably relevant. It reminds us that breakthrough innovations often come from unexpected sources, challenge conventional wisdom, and succeed not through perfection but through practical effectiveness. The tank that rolled out of Soviet factories in 1940 as an experimental vehicle became the instrument of Nazi Germany's defeat. Its journey from drawing board to battlefield supremacy stands as one of the most remarkable engineering and strategic stories of the 20th century. In the end, the T-34 succeeded because it was designed for war as it actually exists, brutal, unpredictable, and decided not by engineering elegance but by the harsh mathematics of production, reliability, and battlefield effectiveness. It was a tank built for the real world by engineers who understood that in warfare, perfect is the enemy of good enough. The T-34 story reveals how single innovations can reshape entire conflicts. What other overlooked engineering breakthroughs changed the course of history? What lessons from wartime innovation apply to today's technological challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into military history fascinating, subscribe for more stories about the weapons, tactics, and decisions that shaped our world. Next week, we'll explore another game-changing innovation, how the Battle of Britain was won not just by brave pilots, but by a revolutionary technology that most people have never heard of. The past holds secrets that illuminate our present. The question is, are we paying attention?